So the funding that we have available in the UK is called Access to Work funding. And not enough people know about this. So tonight's event is a great excuse to be able to tell people a lot more about it. It is central government money provided by the Department of Work and Pensions. And can you still see the slides okay? Because they're looking quite strange for me.
Yeah, so fine, Ursula.
Good. Good, because I can't see what I usually see. And never mind. So it's funding provided by Department of Work and Pensions, and it can help with a number of things that are useful in the workplace. So, for example, paying for support workers, and BSL interpreters is one such example, or it could be travel. And it can pay for help with accessing the recruitment process, such as interviews. So it's for people who are in paid work, and that can look quite different. So it could be part-time work, temporary work, apprentices, and it is also available for self-employed people. So the definition of the disability part of the funding matches the Equality Act. So the main thing is that it's a long-term condition lasting more than 12 months and it impacts daily life. Something that's quite interesting is that you don't always need a formal diagnosis to apply. So if people are experiencing long waiting lists to get a specific condition diagnosed, then please don't let that put you off if you think this is something that's going to be beneficial or useful for you. And especially as we do have long waits for things like autism, ADHD, sometimes people can be accepted for the funding while they're waiting for that sort of thing. So other examples of conditions that may benefit from having some access to work funding are long-term mental health conditions like anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, mobility, and sensory loss like hearing loss or sight loss. So how you actually get to access it is that you do an online application, and there is a QR code in the top corner of the screen in blue, which if you do have a mobile phone handy should take you directly to the link, but if you search access to work it'll come up as the top link usually anyway. It's mostly straightforward. They're open text questions, and one of the nice things is once you've gone through the initial eligibility bit, you can see the headings of the next sections that are coming forward, and then they do give you some character limit guidelines, so they're not looking for lots of detail at this stage. So large employers such as University of Leicester are asked to contribute to the costs of that. And a large employer is an organisation that employs 250 people or more. And University of Leicester here, we have a central pot of funding that covers that costs, but each employer will have their own way of managing that. If you're a small employer with under 50, then the chances are you won't be asked to contribute. And for new staff, the funding is fully covered. So quite important to know that if you apply within 6 weeks of starting a job with a new employer, things are fully covered and you can start ahead of starting with a new job. If people are working in two locations, such as your co-working between home and an office, potentially they can support equipment in both of those locations. So, bit of an overview. You apply online, then you get a phone call from Access to Work. They'll confirm eligibility and can confirm what happens next. Most people will have an appointment to meet with an assessor, which is usually online, and they're not assessing you and your capabilities. They're assessing what's needed and helpful for you to do your job. If you know exactly what you want and you can provide a written rationale and costs, then you can skip that stage if that's helpful for you. And then The next part is sending in a claim to access to work for reimbursement after all of the orders are through. And so here's some examples of the typical things. So here at University of Leicester, software is one of the main things that will get funded for people. We do have some software on our network that people can access, but if that isn't enough to meet people's needs, then it's things like task management, captioning software, speech dictation, or literacy support tools are the most common types of software. But ergonomics are the second most common thing. So that's typically chair, desk, or ergonomic portable aids. And specialist keyboards and mice. So sometimes people have had left-handed mice, for example, recommended. And we still have a lot of people who need to take notes in their work and might find a recording device or a note-taking app particularly relevant for them. So there's two ways that they'll fund a support worker. So the first one is where there's a specific number of sessions. So they can provide training on how to use equipment. So it might say 1 times 2 hours or 3 times 2 hours on something, or you can have one-to-one coaching and coping sessions. So they're particularly helpful for people who have conditions like dyslexia, autism, ADHD, and you can get joint sessions funded. So that can sometimes help with having your line manager in with the session, where it may just be the two of you, or in some people's cases, it may be the team and the people you work with. You have a joint disability awareness session. And it can fund regular ongoing support workers. So communication support, such as a BSL interpreter, is a good example. Or it could be administrative support, or if people can't set up equipment themselves, but they're doing the kind of job where they could instruct somebody else to do that bit, then that might be another way that a support worker helps someone. The things that somebody will look at when they're considering what is suitable, the disability or condition that somebody has, the actual job that they're doing, and the skills and preferences. And it's always really useful to think about what hasn't worked, and a good assessor should guide you through, and why is it? Was it the tool that didn't work? So a different program or a different device might work better for you, or is it something else? So just to summarise, it's the assessment process can be quite useful in its own right. Most often people get more things than they thought of, and it'll recommend things that you probably didn't know were out there. Of course, funding's always useful, but at the moment, there currently are delays in the initial application process, which isn't a good thing, and hopefully it's getting a little bit better very gradually. And there is a bit of administration with dealing with the claim. But here at University of Leicester, that's part of my role. But as I say, different organisations will have their own ways that they manage that. So that's to give you a little bit of an overview of the main access to work funding. But it's worth mentioning that there is a separate mental health service. So everything I've just said doesn't apply to this bit. So you can just go straight to Maximus and access ongoing support up to 9 sessions, and where they will focus on on people whose mental health is impacting their work. And again, you do not have to have a formal diagnosis. It just needs to be affecting your work life. And it does need to be for people who are in work, but again, it can be part-time, temporary work, apprenticeships. If people are signed off sick, you can access this support as well. And there's a little QR code in the top corner. So that's a bit of an overview for you. So now the really exciting bit is I'm very pleased to say that we have Rob with us, and he's going to talk about his research. So Dr. Rob Wilks is an alumni of University of Leicester, as am I, myself as well. And so we will be switching people's cameras off because that helps the bandwidth and helps Rob and Julie to be able to focus on each other. And Rob has some slides to share. So we will have some time at the end for questions. So do use the Q&A to put your questions in the Q&A section, and we will have some time to ask questions at the end.
Is it over to me now?
So it's over to you both. Yeah.
Thank you. Just going to share my slides. Bear with me a second. Thank you very much. Yeah. Well, hello and good evening, everyone. It's lovely to be back again. It's been a couple of years since my previous presentation. I'm delighted to be back as an alumni of Leicester. I have, first of all, obtained my LLM in employment law here. And then a few years later, I undertook my PhD and completed that 4 years ago now. Time doesn't half fly. Thank you for the opportunity to present my research to you today. I have consolidated a couple of things. So first of all, my PhD thesis and the contents of that, alongside some further research that I've undertaken since. I've developed something called the deaf legal theory. And so my presentation will talk about the relationship between my thesis and the deaf legal theory. I'm currently a lecturer at Cardiff University, the professional law course, but in January I'll be moving to UWE or UE in Bristol as senior lecturer there. So I'm looking forward to new challenges ahead. So my topic, as you can see, is exposing equality law as it relates to deaf people. And the aim is to develop deaf legal theory. So here we go, just a quick overview of what it is I'm talking about, all various aspects of this. So I'll first of all start with my introduction. So what the problem is, essentially. Before we're talking about solutions or any analysis, it's useful, first of all, to look at the problem and why on earth it is that we need to research the issues. Then we're going to look at what deaf legal theory is, just so you can bear it in mind as an expose, really, of the law. We'll be looking at the deaf legal dilemma next, and this then relates to identity and how identity fits in and correlates to the law and the problems. We'll explore those later. Then we'll be looking at the deaf equality concepts. It's really important to understand the aim of equality, first of all, because we can't expect equality to be achieved if we don't understand or have no idea what equality really means. So it'll be my attempt to explain what equality means to various people. Then I'm going to be having a look at deaf disabled rights. Here really it's a doctrinal piece. It's the doctrinal part of the research. So where I'll be talking about the law, around whether the law actually talks about deaf people or not, and then my conclusion at the end. So that's where we'll be going this evening. So let's crack on. So we'll start with the deaf legal theory and what it means. So deaf legal theory might seem a bit strange. It's a very new concept. It's a new concept in jurisprudence. Now, if you have studied law in the past, you'll probably remember that jurisprudence, you might have studied it in your law degree, undergraduate, but another name for jurisprudence could be philosophy of law, if you like, or legal philosophy. So that's jurisprudence. It's, how do I explain it? Theories, for example, critical legal studies, legal positivism, legal realists, and critical race theory, and feminist legal theories. So all of these are various concepts and theories that might sound familiar, and the deaf legal theory is an addition to that list. I feel that the deaf legal theory fits really well with critical legal studies, because this would include feminist legal theory and critical race theory, where I feel probably deaf legal theory fits the most here with feminist legal theory. Actually, there's a lot of similarities and lots of crossovers. Critical legal studies is basically where you challenge attitudes that the law that the law is neutral. So you can challenge that notion. So the lawmakers are supposedly neutral. The people who create the law should be objective all the way through when they're thinking about fairness and thinking about ensuring that there are no specific groups of people at disadvantage because of the law that's being created. So there are some legal positivists that would say that the law is neutral and the law is fair and it achieves justice. Critical legal theory says, no, it doesn't. It isn't always the case. So that's the point of critical legal theory, really. So my theory is that because the law and the legal system is hearing, and I say that, it's hearing centric, it focuses on people who can hear, and it is ignorant to deaf issues. This means that the law reflects a hearing society, the majority, the hearing society views. So therefore, it's hearing subjective. Also, the law is patriarchal. So very male dominated in its perspective, that patriarchal attitude of looking after disabled people, looking after women and so on, and marginalised groups, the white patriarchal lawmakers' attitudes can seep into and influence those laws that have been created. And because of this, you can argue that the law is hearing subjective. Very imbalanced and biased to a hearing world and society. It's also audist, so discriminates against deaf people. The word racist, you would have heard, sexist. The word audist means discriminating against deaf people. And also, again, in relation to the patriarchy, that the mainstream law is therefore looks after deaf people. And in the UK, we have a lot of charities that help the deaf people, and it very much sits alongside this kind of model. So when we look at hearing constructs, what I mean is that deaf people are often rewarded if they agree to fit in to the law and what is out there. So, for example, the law might say that deaf people can claim benefits and you can apply for access to work that Ursula talked earlier about. So you can claim benefits and like access to work, and you can get free hearing aids and cochlear implants on the NHS. And deaf people would have to fit into whatever was provided, which isn't always what deaf people want or need. So that's deaf legal theory, very, very in its basic form there. So if we talk about deaf legal theory method, here is a model that helps us apply the deaf legal theory to any area of law. The best way for me to describe this is like a pair of glasses. So when you would put a pair of glasses on to look at a particular area of law, so you're going to choose a particular type of glasses, a particular lens to explore that law. And there are all various elements of the model that we can use to apply. So if we talk about the frame, that's the first part, the first part that you can see on the slide. So the first part of the method is the frame. So how does society, and what's society's understanding of deaf people through this piece of law? Okay, so usually it'll be a medical model. So, oh, you have a hearing loss, you have a hearing problem, we need to try and fix you and cure you. The second point here is assumptions. So assumptions here, we mean what are society's assumptions around deaf people that very well may be wrong, may be right. Third step is participation. So here we ask, so when the law was created, specifically if it was created for deaf people, were deaf people consulted with? Was there any say by deaf people in how the law was constructed? Then we have cultural order, and here we talk about the law representing cultures and society's culture. So the cultural order is how does society's culture imposed on deaf people? How far does that go? And then the fifth and sixth stages, the fifth being the application, which means when you've done your piece of doctrinal research there about the law, what does the law say and how does that apply to deaf people? And then you look at the impact, so in a socio-legal way. So what's the law's impact on deaf people specifically? And then I would then next have a look at oppression. Does the law actually maintain the status quo, or does it actually make a difference to deaf people, or does it inadvertently make things worse? And finally, then we think about what lessons are to be learned from the exposé. So bear this in mind, the method. Okay, so we'll focus again now back onto equality law, which is the basis of my thesis, my PhD. So I looked into what equality law means, and quite simply, it's supposed to prevent deaf people, protect deaf people. It's supposed to protect deaf people. But if you have a look at the list here on the slide, actually, it creates a lot of problems for deaf people. So if we can do a comparison with the national average of people in employment, deaf people are certainly worse off than the hearing majority in society. And still true today that deaf children typically leave compulsory education with a reading age of 8 years old, primary school age. That means, of course, that has a knock-on effect of their ability to compete in the labour market. And when we look at GCSE results, they are less likely to achieve if you compare that to the hearing majority of people. Now, if we look at deaf people's access to the legal service, it's quite dire. Access to interpreters and funding is very difficult. And if a deaf person is imprisoned, it is what we call a double sentence because they are so isolated. Staff cannot communicate with them. Other prisoners aren't able to sign either. And so therefore they are doubly punished in if you look at it that way. So their experiences are generally worse off. And also when you look at health, definitely find it more difficult to access healthcare. So what's gone wrong then? So the first thing I want to do is to look at identity. What do we mean by identity? I want to explore 3 different areas here: the hearing world that I've mentioned versus the disabled world and the deaf world. Okay, so we're going to look at the hearing world first of all. It goes without saying, it's obvious. It's what you experience every day. I'm assuming you're all listening now to our interpreter and you can all hear. And so the hearing world you take for granted. You probably never even think of yourself as a hearing person. If I said, what's your identity? I'm sure you wouldn't say, I'm hearing. It's something you'd never think about. But from our perspective, we would call you guys living in the hearing world, you take it for granted. And really, I would say you can view society and equality law using either the medical model of disability or the social model of disability, if you're looking at disabled people now. So if you're going to talk about the disabled world and you're looking at it through a medical model, you'll always see the disabled person as having the problem. There's something wrong with them. They have a disability. They are the ones that need to be fixed, and it's almost their fault because you can't fit into the rest of society because you have this impairment. You have a medical condition. The aim, therefore, is to try and cure that and reduce the impact of that condition. Or you could look at the disabled world through a social model. And the social model will say, actually, the person is disabled because of societal barriers. Society shouldn't really expect the disabled person to fit in. Actually, how can we make our society accessible for them? Let's remove the barriers. So if we look at deaf people, if everyone could learn sign language, there would be no disabling issue for deaf people. So you can see where I'm going here. So that is, we have the medical and social model. We also have something called the minority group model, very American. And we also have the cultural model that talks about being disabled as a culture. And so if we look at the deaf world now, this is the bit more that's interesting for me personally, obviously. The argument here is that deaf people are a cultural and linguistic group of people. We do not see ourselves as disabled. We see ourselves as a linguistic minority. We have our own culture, our own history, our own traditions, everything that a culture has, our own language, which is different from the rest of society, including disabled people. And so we sometimes refer to ourselves and are talked about as signed language people. And what's interesting with that is that includes people who aren't deaf. So it could be hearing children of deaf parents who imbibe sign language and deaf culture as part of the family setting. So sign language people also can include people who can hear. My PhD thesis argues that deaf people could be considered as an ethnic group. And that's because if you think about case law in the UK, it talks about what an ethnic group might mean. And the Mandela case, this is where it was decided that an ethnic group would be defined, and it defined it as having two essential characteristics, and the rest were kind of optional added extras. So I feel that deaf people match all of the criteria. For example, long shared history, cultural traditions, we have a common language, and we have common literature. Our signed language isn't written, but we capture now, in modern times, our stories on video. We are an oppressed group and a minority. There is one question mark, though, about having a common religion. Obviously, deaf people are not homogenous in that way. We practice all religions, and some people are not religious, but you could argue that the way deaf people practice their religion is the same. So they might belong to a deaf church, or they might go to a church or a synagogue or a temple where sign language interpreters are provided. So it's more about how the religion is practiced that is common rather than the religion itself. So a useful model for you to think about when we're talking about each of these groups you see in the various models. So now I've explained those, I'm going to dig a little deeper. because that's been a bit vague, and it's kind of useful now, I think, for me to give you an example. And who better to talk to you about than me? Well, I know myself very well, and I know my own identity. So this is going to be a bit easy now for me to talk to you about, and all my various intersectionalities. So I am deaf with a lowercase d. And you can see there, I've got two deaf words on there, one with a capital and one with the smaller case, lowercase d. The lowercase d denotes my ears and the hearing, the deafness that I experience, the medical part. And the capital D is my cultural part, so my cultural linguistic minority part of me. So I'm deaf, I experience deafness, and I am disabled. Apparently, I have to accept that because I claim disabled benefits and I have access to work. So I can't say I'm not disabled. I don't get that. I have to go, yes, government, I am a disabled person. I can't say, well, actually, I'm not, because I'm a cultural linguistic deaf person. Well, you don't get your benefits then. OK, so I have to identify as disabled, white and British and very Welsh. And I am a husband, and I'm also a lawyer and an academic and a lecturer. Now, you can see that all those identities that I hold are all protected. They're all protected in law. So my hearing loss, my deafness and being disabled are protected under the Equality Act. And the same for my ethnicity, for being British and Welsh. The husband, that's race law. The husband part is under employment law. I have the protection to have parental leave. I have the right for paternity leave for when my children were born. So I can claim benefits, child's tax credits and stuff like that, and child benefits. I could claim those because I have children, so I'm protected. Now, hang on a minute, there's something missing here. So I am very much a capital D, culturally deaf person, linguistic minority person, but I'm not protected. Maybe that's why deaf people are encountering so many problems with the law. I've mentioned the Equality Act protects me because I'm disabled, but it doesn't protect me as a deaf cultural person. So bear that in mind a moment. This provides a nice segue into the deaf legal dilemma. Some deaf people wholly reject the label of being disabled because they feel that there's, with regards to intersectionality, that they have various identities and being disabled isn't one of them because disabled people generally don't use sign language. And so therefore, like anyone else, you can choose which aspects of your identities that you want to show when. Yeah. The deaf legal dilemma explains then why there are problems when you rely on the disabled identity alone in law. At the moment, deaf people can only challenge any discrimination if they accept themselves as a disabled person. That's fine. But it doesn't solve all the problems, you see, because it does not recognise my language, doesn't recognise my right to have an interpreter, only if it's seen as a reasonable adjustment with in the disability sphere. So it doesn't take into account my culture, my heritage, my traditions, and actually we quite often find that being culturally deaf can clash, if you like, with the law. It doesn't fit. Ultimately, we don't have any choice. We have to accept the label of being disabled, otherwise we don't get access to rights. So on the same theme, when I finished my PhD, I then went on to develop the idea that looking at deaf and disabled rights and language minority rights to help me understand these issues more clearly. Now, basically, the deaf disabled rights are where the law gives me rights because I'm disabled. So, for example, the Equality Act. I've got to accept the definition of disability there so that I can claim discrimination, for example. And that also works for other laws, so human rights law, and also the Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So I have to say, yes, I am disabled, okay, to exercise my rights there under those laws. And so this is what we're used to, right? But if we look at language minority rights, there's even less available, but you can find them in law. So one of them being sign language recognition. Some of you might be aware now that the UK Parliament have accepted BSL as a bona fide language 2022, and we saw the BSL Act. So we have recognition of our language. Now, signed languages are different all over the world, and other countries have recognised legally their signed languages. So when we look at language minority rights, we can find that there, but the problem is it's really tokenistic. It doesn't have any teeth. It doesn't give us any explicit rights. The deaf disabled rights do, but language minority rights, we're way behind. So, for example, if we look at the bottom here of the slides, oh, bear with me a second. There were some examples, sorry, of language minority rights. There they are. You can see them in the bottom box there. Okay. So now we're going to drill down a little bit more into what equality means, because this concept's really important to understand, because this is what we're talking about, right? Equality. So can you imagine in the academic world what's being debated about here? What does equality mean? Because I can tell you something, there is no one definition. It's open to interpretation, so you can imagine. And for me, doing my PhD, trying to work out what equality meant was a right headache. It took me 2 years to work this out, and I'm still not 100% sure. However, this is my interpretation, Rob's interpretation that gets thrown into the mix with everyone else's. Okay, so the problem is equality is very abstract, and it almost has a high status, a status that is ethereal. Like, you can't define what God is. That's really difficult to define, and everyone will have their own idea of that. It's quite similar to that. And so I'm thinking, how am I going to make sense of this? I'm a lawyer. I like to categorize things. I like order, and I like to label stuff. And so when I came across this, I read Vickers, who said, 2 seconds. Lovely. So that there were various analyses of equality that may be suited to different protected grounds. Aha, thanks, Vickers. That's really helpful, actually, because now I don't have to. Sorry, I've got some freezing on the screen. I don't have. So I do apologise. I don't have to work out all concepts. I just need to think about the ones that are relevant to deaf people. So that helped make my life a bit easier. Thank you very much. All right, so that was useful. We'll come back to that again in a moment, but I did find another concept useful here. And this is from Weston, who talked about precepts of equality. Precepts are like the categories of the concepts. So I realised on my research there are 3 main precepts. There's formal, substantive, and transformative equality. And they're almost like standards of measurement. So I'm going to do this through pictures here, and you can see on your screen here, it might start to make a bit more sense when you look at it. So if we look at the precept of formal equality, that's about treating everyone the same. So equality is treating everyone the same. So here we got a scenario where there's an absolutely gorgeous, stunning view over that fence. The problem is that fence is in the way, which is not a problem if you're the taller person and you can see over it like our first person. So the person in the middle and the person on the right are not able to see over the fence. But we've treated everyone the same, haven't we, there? Everyone is stood on the ground. Obviously that doesn't work, treating everybody in the same way. 2 people out of 3 can't see the gorgeous view. So let's have a look at the precept of substantive equality. They recognise here that there is some disadvantage and therefore will provide something to remove the disadvantage. So they've provided some blocks at varying heights so they can both see over the fence. Yay, problem solved. The only problem here is that what if they decide to come back next week to have a look at the lovely view? They'll be at home going, oh, I love that view. It made my day. Let's go back. And oh, the blocks have gone. I've got to apply or ask someone to bring the blocks again. Yeah, so you're with me now. It's a temporary fix. Then let's look at the precept of transformative equality. And this is where someone says, let's just get rid of the fence. Da-da! Simple. It's transformative for everybody. Formal and substantive equality are very common in law. You don't find much transformative equality in law. So what I can do now is use these precepts to categorise the concepts of equality that are relevant to deaf people. So that's what I did next. So what are the concepts that are relevant to the deaf world? I won't bore you with the detail because I'm enjoying myself too much and I'm running out of time. So I will speed up a bit. The concepts of equality that I feel are relevant are equal worth and dignity, equality of opportunity, social inclusion, and challenge to oppression. So I categorised those into the precepts, and social inclusion and challenging oppression are more examples of transformative equality. Equal treatment and equality of opportunity are more formal, so you can see how things are starting to make sense. The next step was to apply the law, because I've got to, I'm a lawyer, it's just something I have to do. So if we have a look here, and at the top here, I've labelled which pieces of law contain which concepts and precepts. So, for example, the European Convention on Human Rights is very formal equality. It treats all humans the same. There's no extra for certain people. No, it's standard. So very formal equality. The Equality Act has a mixture, actually, a mixture of formal and substantive and a bit of transformative in there. So it's formal because it has direct discrimination. There's a test for that, which is very, very formal. You have to prove that you are treated differently from another person who doesn't have that protected characteristic. Very formal equality to justify yourself to other people in terms of equal treatment. But the reasonable adjustment part, I've noticed, is quite substantive, but it's usually deemed more reasonable to provide a one-off piece of reasonable adjustment than something that's more regular. we talked about regular need earlier, but if you think about deaf people, we need interpreters a lot for meetings because not everyone can sign. So we need a lot of interpreters. It's an ongoing, and that's deemed less reasonable in law sometimes. So the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This is a mixture of transformative and formal and substantive. But what's interesting about this, with the transformative element, it talks about sign language specifically, and sign languages and the recognition that sign language has a place in deaf people's lives. The problem with those is the enforcement of these pieces of legislation. They all rely on the individual enforcement model, so you have to do it yourself, and there are a lot of barriers in enforcing that and making claims. So let's go back to the model, the deaf legal theory model, and we'll apply it to equality law and see what we've learned so far. The frame is obvious. It's all around health and the medical profession, and they see deafness as an impairment, and that the solutions would be to provide adjustments. So the assumption is through a medical model that deaf people have a hearing loss, and that's the problem, it's the condition, and you have to fit into general society and lip read us and just try and get along. No adjustments to providing sign language, that kind of thing. Participation, very rarely have deaf people ever been consulted on pieces of law that affect them. So all three pieces of legislation earlier, deaf people were not consulted upon. If we look at the cultural order, it's definitely hearing oppressive. It doesn't consider deaf people at all when making the law. Application, we've looked at those three pieces of legislation and the impact on deaf people. So very minimal impact on deaf people's lives in a positive way, because it's an individual enforcement model. It's very difficult to challenge or make claims. When it comes to oppression, the law fails to challenge oppression. And the lessons learned are that it needs to be easier to use, to enforce the United Nations treaty. It's really useful, but at the moment we have to go through your domestic processes first before you can take it to the UN. So lots of barriers. And I mentioned earlier about reoccurring adjustments being seen as less reasonable. That needs to be dealt with. You can see how the deaf legal theory now has been applied to the law. So that's the expose. Obviously, we need more time than a 30-minute presentation for me to go through it, but this gives you just a flavour of what we've learned from this exercise. To conclude, we know that deaf people have to identify as disabled in order to access their rights and claim for discrimination, for example. And this is known as the deaf legal dilemma. Should I'm going to have to claim as a disabled person. So the relevant equality analysis to the deaf world have been identified, and we've found the precepts of equality that are used to identify the effectiveness of equality law. So it's a measurement, if you like, of how effective equality law is. We've then looked at the formal substantive equality having shortcomings, but how transformative equality is the potential for real change. There's been an in-depth expose of the equality law through a deaf legal theory lens, which we've just done very, very quickly there. And what's left now is to look at minority language rights and to look at the law. It's very scarce. It is quite a new thing, but we don't have enough research about the impact of those language minority rights on deaf people, particularly around the Sign Language Acts. So this is an interesting development as a postdoc, that I've undertaken, and that's it from me. There's my email address for you if you want to contact me. I am leaving Cardiff University on the 15th of December, however, so that's my email until then. If you want to email me there, email me quickly. Anytime after that, Google me in the new year. You'll find me on the internet quite easily.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you.
I think I've stopped sharing.
Great. I'm sure there's a lot there that people listening won't have heard of before. And I would imagine a lot of people are probably quite shocked with some of the statistics and the backgrounds that you mentioned. And the double prison. I bet not many people have considered that. So that's a lot of concepts there. That's fantastic. We've actually had quite a few questions start to come in. So one of them is about completing your study. How did you find completing your PhD at Leicester?
Oh, awful. No, wouldn't recommend it. No. No. I must say the support I had was fantastic. I had 2 supervisors from the law school who were just amazing through the whole process. They had a huge job actually, because my area of research is so unique and niche, never been explored before. So that was a challenge to the school. And also my supervisors' areas were in employment law, that's their expertise. But my thesis was really barely touching on that. It was more an expose in general, but wonderfully supportive. Certainly helped me to identify what I needed to focus on, because my original plan was so wide reaching. So, you know, the usual pinpoint, you know, narrow it down. But they provided me with a scholarship, which I'm eternally grateful for, through my PhD. I cannot complain at all. The only problem I've got is how far it was. It's a bit far for me because I live in South Wales. So I'm in South Wales, and it's a bit awkward to get to, isn't it? It's like, it's just really kind of, it's not like a straight road. It's a bit awkward, but that was it really.
Absolutely. And you're leading to one of the other questions we were asked as well, is how does it feel to be working on a new theory in law?
Exciting, very exciting. And I say that because I've been working on it for about a year. But at the beginning, I was asked by the University of Birmingham to give a talk about it, and I'd only been doing it for like 2 months, and I was like, whoa, just started. It forced me to crack on with it really, and since then I've applied for various funding streams to develop the deaf legal theory and create a network globally, a global network. So I have now called for first contributions to an edited volume. I've already had about 10 responses from various people around the world, deaf people, academics from America, Portugal, Belgium, and Finland. So lots of really exciting times ahead, I'd say.
Fantastic, great. And this is brilliant because you're leading on towards one of the other questions that we've had. What advice would Rob and Ursula give for anyone looking to start a new career or join a new workplace, ensuring they're receiving the right support from the start if they have a disability, which might be an illness that's affecting them in the workplace? So obviously you're about to embark on that new process.
That's a good question. I've never had problems starting in the workplace. Touch wood, I'm about to start. But I've always, when I've been offered the job, I know what I need. I think because I'm a qualified solicitor, I've advised over 2,000 deaf people about over a period of 11 years where they have experienced hideous experiences of discrimination in the workplace. I've been very, very fortunate. I think what's important, and I think that might be different, is that I am very transparent in what I need. I say from the get-go, I am a deaf person. We all need sign language interpretation. It helps to have a good CV in any case. You do have to work hard. You do have to say, look, I'm proving myself here. Evidence your experience and your skills and your knowledge and qualifications. All of that helps in any case. But knowing what you need when you're offered the job, actually, I think sometimes it's useful not to always disclose that you have the disability unless you're offered the interview. Because at that point, it's difficult for them to say no. You've got an opportunity then to say, I'm this amazing person, you need to employ me because of X, Y, Z, get the interview, and then tell them what you need from the workplace. Because when I start my job, I go, right, I need flashing lights in my office. I need a doorbell outside my door. Don't bother knocking because that ain't going to work. So ring the doorbell, my light flashes. Any headsets on phones, please, for my interpreters. My interpreters needs to be hands-free, so they don't want to hold the receiver. Tiny little things, but I know what I need. I know what my interpreters need. I know how many hours I need from access to work. And it's really difficult, I think, if you're embarking upon this for the first time and you don't know what you need. It's worth talking to people in a similar situation to you and ask them what they get in the workplace, because you can find things that you'd never expect. Or come and talk to me. I've got loads of experience about what's out there. I know stuff that's out there. And you also ask the expert, Ursula, who will talk to you about what's out there. Don't be frightened to ask. What's the worst can happen? They say no. Oh, well.
Absolutely. I definitely agree with you about choosing when to disclose and to say something. So hopefully if someone can get through an application stage for an interview, then I would agree that interview stage is a good time to talk about these things. I know I've had disagreements with other people on that, where some people have the thinking you should be able to be upfront and you should be not afraid. And that's okay in theory, but the rights of disabled people are relatively recent and the culture is taking time to catch up. So yes, in theory, all workplaces should treat you the same, but in reality, that's not always the case.
I totally agree. Reality, unfortunately, that's the world we live in. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's the access to work bit that's why I think one of the strengths is that assessment bit. And if people are studying at a college or a university level, then talking about your needs and software equipment support that helps you, it's recognizing that then can translate into the workplace. And that's why I like to make sure if students have some kind of awareness there's a thing when you get into the workplace. They don't have to have the detail, but you can have your left-handed mouse. It doesn't matter. Because whether you're a student or not, you can take that with you into the workplace. You can take that software, that support, whatever that is. And I'd also agree with you that speaking to people who are doing that job or in that industry, there's a lot of people who really are very keen to mentor other people. Absolutely.
And also, just to add in there as well, be proud of who you are and your identities. You are worth employing. Never apologise and say that you're not. It's a plus.
Yes, absolutely. So, we've got another question, but what is your end goal with deaf legal theory?
I just want the world to know that deaf people are facing barriers still in this day and age, and let's solve them. Let's get rid of them. That's the aim. That it resolves the barriers, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think your detailed, informative session is helping contribute to that. Definitely. So we've got another question going back to one of the specific points from your talk. In terms of the double sentence for deaf prisoners, how often has this been raised as an issue with the relevant bodies, and what support has been provided to the prisoners?
Excellent question. I believe that there was a report called it was about double sentencing. Back in the early 2000s, I'm talking turn of the millennia. And more recently, an academic at UCLan in Preston has done her PhD on deaf people's experience in prison. She visited various deaf prisoners around the UK and interviewed them, which made for fascinating reading. What a wonderful thesis that was. It was the first time that we'd had access to that. And she has set up, what's it called? An academic expert group, if you like, an expert group, which will advise Laura, advise her and her colleague Dan. And Dan is the one who wrote the original report. I think it was 2002. And they've established a project where they have great contacts now within His Majesty's Prison Service. So this expert group now is working on trying to improve this, and I'm on the expert group now, so I've just joined that. So we'll see how that goes. So interesting work there, but it's slow moving, and it's taken all this time, but at least something is happening at the moment.
Excellent. Good. Pleased to hear you're on that group. And a similar related question, I guess, is we have somebody thanking you for your detailed, informative talk. And they go on to say deafness is still a taboo in many faith communities. How can we bring awareness of deafness so deaf people don't get labels and feel isolated?
Absolutely, which is why we talked about cultural order, that of the deaf legal theory model. That's a really important part because it exposes the way that deaf people are treated depending upon the cultural order of that country or faith or community group. It's really important for us to understand the cultural order and the relationship between deaf people's experiences and the culture of that specific country or group.
Fantastic. Thank you. So I don't think we've got any further questions, unless I've missed some.
I've some great questions though. Some really good questions.
Absolutely, and a lot of what you've said has led naturally into the next thing. Fantastic. So this seems like a good point to close. So the session has been recorded, and thank you very much for doing your research and highlighting it here this evening for us as well. This is just fantastic. So my colleague has put a link to a feedback form. So we're always keen to hear from people about what they would like to hear next and how we can improve things. That's fantastic. So look forward to meeting more alumni on future events. And thank you, Julie, for your interpreting.
Pleasure. That's Rob doing a deaf clap for me, which is no point in doing this for deaf people. Yeah.
Fantastic.
So goodbye, everyone. Good evening. Good night.